Once there was a dog who liked biting. The dog bit a stick. The dog bit a shoe. The dog bit a man. Then the dog was bitten by the man. The dog did not like being bitten. The dog bit the man. The dog was bitten by the man. The dog liked biting. The dog didn't like being bitten. The dog bit the man is what we call an active sentence. The dog was bitten by the man is a passive sentence. The first thing to notice is that the meanings are completely different. The dog bit the man is this picture. The dog was bitten by the man is this picture. Now, in an active sentence, we have a subject, the dog, the verb bit, and the object, the man. The subject in an active sentence does the action. So the dog is the one doing the biting, whereas the object is receiving the action. The man is receiving the biting. But in the passive sentence it's opposite. In the passive sentence, here the subject is receiving the action. The dog is receiving the biting, and the person or thing that is doing the action comes after the preposition by, in this case, the man. More examples. The dog liked biting, active. The dog didn't like being bitten, passive. Again, the dog liked biting, the dog is doing the action. The dog didn't like being bitten, the dog is receiving the action. So far, we've only been using the past tense as an example. The dog bit the man, the dog was bitten by the man, but we can use other tenses for this as well. Imagine this is something that's happening right now. The dog is biting the man now. The dog is being bitten by the man. Or maybe it's a habit, something that happens every day. The dog bites the man every day. The dog is bitten by the man every day. Or something that will happen in the future. The dog will bite the man. The dog will be bitten by the man. Or perhaps the dog had bitten the man. The dog had been bitten by the man. So you can see we've got many different forms here. Is bitten, was bitten, is being bitten, will be bitten, had been bitten. But there are some things that are the same. For example, all of the passive forms, whether they're in the present, the past, or the future, use what we call the past participle, or some people call this the verb 3. Bite, bit, bitten. This is true for all the passive tenses. Then there's some form of the be verb. Is, was, being, be, been. And in some cases, although not all, in some cases there's extra auxiliaries which will come before the be verb, like had or will, or in this case, another form of the be verb. So because we are going to be using the be verb for all the passive tenses, we should probably review what are the forms of the be verb. The base form is be. Present simple is am, is, are. I am, he is, you are. Past simple is was for singular subjects, were for plural subjects. The past participle is been, and the present participle is being. Let's change the example here to pizza being eaten. So talking about pizza being eaten in the passive, you can see here the passive voice for all of the 12 English verb tenses plus the infinitives here. To be eaten, to be being eaten, to have been eaten, to have been being eaten. But let's focus on the three main ones, the past tense, the present tense, and the future tense. In the simple aspect, we can say pizza was eaten, pizza is eaten, pizza will be eaten. So we have the past participle plus the be verb in the past, present, and future. For the continuous, we have pizza was being eaten, pizza is being eaten, pizza will be being eaten. So being plus the past participle, and then was, is, or will be. For the perfect aspect, we had been eaten, has been eaten, and will have been eaten. So you can see that the been plus the past participle stays the same, and then the tense goes on the have. So had, has, will have. And then for the perfect continuous, we have had been being eaten, has been being eaten, and will have been being eaten. So here we have been being eaten staying the same, and then the tense going on the have, had, has, and will have. So this is the complete list of all the passive tenses in English, but it's important to note that some of these are very rarely used in real life, particularly the perfect continuous passives. So had been being eaten. You are unlikely to hear this in real life conversation, partly because it's so long and difficult to say. English speakers will tend to avoid it, and partly because it's a very specific situation to use the present continuous tense. But the simple passives and the continuous passives you will hear being used a lot. Important to note here that the subject verb agreement is an issue in the present passive. I am bitten, he is bitten, they are bitten. And in the present continuous, although the being stays the same, the first be verb here will change for the subject. This is also true for the past passive, I was bitten, they were bitten. And the past continuous passive, I was being bitten, they were being bitten. But those are the only ones. For the rest of these, you don't have to worry about subject-verb agreement. Except for has. Pizza has been eaten. If you were to change this to a plural subject, it could be the apples have been eaten. So for has in the present perfect tense and present perfect continuous, for is, am, are, and for was and were, you need to change that to agree with the subject. The passive can also be used with modal verbs and semi-modals. So modal verbs, pizza can be eaten. Semi-modal, pizza has to be eaten. Gerunds can be passive. We saw an example of this earlier. The dog didn't like being bitten. The cat likes being held. Here's another example. So it's always a form of the past participle plus being, or rather being is first. So being plus the past participle. Now, passive sentences always have an active equivalent. So, for example, the dog bites the man is bitten by the dog. In this case, the subject, when we change it into the passive, goes behind the by at the end of the sentence, and the object moves to the front of the sentence to become the subject. So these two sentences have the same meaning. The dog bites the man is bitten by the dog. And then here, the man bites the dog is bitten by the man. These two sentences have the same meaning, with the subject moving to behind the by and the object moving to the front of the sentence. The by phrase is optional. So you can say the man is bitten by the dog, but you don't need the by. You can just say the man is bitten. Or the dog is bitten by the man. Again, you don't need the by. Now, talking about the use of the passive, in American schools, students are often taught to not use the passive. As far as I can tell, This is only an American thing. It's not true in British schools. It's not true in Australian schools. But in America, writing teachers will often teach students not to use the passive in their school writing assignments. The reason is that the passive is sometimes seen as boring. Active verbs are supposed to be more exciting. So he wrote the book. This is more active. He is doing something. The book was written by him. Here the book isn't doing anything, so it seems to be a little bit boring to put that at the front of the sentence. Plus, it makes the sentence longer and more difficult to say was written by. Wrote is much simpler. Another reason that American students are sometimes taught not to use the passive voice is because the passive voice can be seen as imprecise. It's not clear sometimes who did what. And sometimes it can be used by politicians as a way to avoid responsibility. So here's a famous example here. President Bush, mistakes were made. This is a way that politicians, presidents, leaders don't have to say, I made mistakes. They can say mistakes are made, and it's a way to get rid of the responsibility. And for that reason, some writing teachers don't like it. But it's important to remember the passive is very useful for a number of functions. In this case here, our little story about the dog, we wanted to use the passive voice at the end because the story was about the dog. The story wasn't about the man. The dog was the subject of all the sentences, so we wanted to keep the dog as the subject to show that the dog was the focus of the story. The passive can also be used for connecting sentences together. So, for example, this is a very important book. It was written by my grandfather 50 years ago. What we commonly do in English sentences is we put the new information at the end of the sentence. This is a very important book. And then we use the information that's at the end of the sentence to begin the next sentence. It. So the end of the sentence is book. The beginning of the next sentence is it, which refers back to book. By using the passive, we can keep this structure where the end of one sentence becomes the focus of the new sentence. Otherwise, we would have to say, this is a very important book. My grandfather wrote it 50 years ago, but that sounds a little bit strange because our focus was on the book. The book was the thing connecting the two sentences together. We can also use the passive in cases where the action is not important. Where the person doing the action is not important or not known. For example, this house was built over 20 years ago, over 200 years ago. This house was built over 200 years ago. In this case, we could say the workers built the house over 200 years ago, but the workers are actually not important. They're not the focus, and maybe we don't even know who built the house. So we would just use the passive here. For this reason, the passive is very commonly used in describing a process. For example, here, how coffee is made, right? So first the cherries are picked, then the green beans are grown, then the beans are roasted, then the coffee is brewed, and then a cup of coffee is made. We're keeping the focus on the coffee. It's not important to talk about the people doing it, so we use the passive voice. Now, only verbs with an object can be used in the passive. So, he ate pizza. This one has an object, and we can tell because we can ask the question, what did he eat? He ate the pizza, so the pizza was eaten by him. But verbs without an object, for example, he died, we've got a subject and a verb, but no object. Possibly we might have something else in the sentence like he died last Tuesday, but this isn't an object. This is just telling us when he died. So a sentence like this without an object cannot be used in the passive. And again, if you're not sure whether or not there's an object in the sentence, you can just try and change the sentence into a what did subject verb question. But the objects of prepositions can often be used in a passive. So he paid for the food. Here, food is not technically the object. It's part of a prepositional phrase with for. But we can make a passive sentence out of this by moving the object of the preposition to the front. The food was paid for by him. There are also verbs that have both direct objects and indirect objects. So for example, he gave the teacher an apple. Here the apple is a direct object and teacher is what we would call the indirect object, or some people would say that this verb has two objects. We can make two kinds of passives here. We could say the teacher was given an apple, or an apple was given to the teacher. And again, for both cases, the by him is optional. Stative verbs are not usually used in the passive. So, he has a car is here has is what we call a state verb. It's describing the situation. So we can't say the car was had by him. Or the apple costs $5. We can't use this one in the passive either. Or she resembles her father. Here again, we can't use it in the passive. So verbs that are simply describing the way things are, simply describing the state that things are in, with no action, don't usually go into the passive. There usually has to be some action. The object has to be affected in some way by the verb in order for it to take a passive. That being said, though, stative verbs in the passives are more acceptable if they are describing something general. So, she is liked by me is a bit questionable as an English sentence. We could say it maybe, but it sounds a little bit strange. But she is liked by everyone sounds like a much better English sentence. So if it's describing a general state or something in general, it's more acceptable to put stative verbs in the passive. Last thing we'll talk about is the get passive. So occasionally, get is used instead of the be verb. So I got fired from my job. We could say I was fired from my job, but get could also go in here. I got caught cheating. My favorite TV show got canceled. Or so far these have all been past simple, but we could do other forms as well. I'm always getting rejected. Now, the get passive is normally used for something bad. So when you use the get passive, you're showing that you feel bad about this. I'm always getting rejected. I don't like it. My favorite TV show got canceled. It's not a good thing. I got fired from my job. Bad thing. I got caught cheating. Again, it's a bad thing. So the get passive is used for something negative, and it would be used instead of the be verb.